The year is 793 AD. The sun rises over Lindisfarne Monastery, but this dawn brings no tranquility. Instead, the horizon reveals longships slicing through the North Sea fog like predators stalking their prey. Viking warriors storm from their ships onto the rocky shore, their axes gleaming in the pale morning light. Within hours, the monastery is a ruin, its treasures stolen, its monks either scattered or dead. But for the women in the nearby villages, this is just the beginning of their nightmare. When we think about Viking raids, we often picture fierce warriors battling with swords, buildings burning, and gold being stolen. What history books often leave out is what happened to the women who survived these violent attacks. Their stories have been buried under centuries of romanticized tales about Norse exploration and conquest. Today, we're going to reveal the grim reality that awaited these women after the longships left. You might think you know what went on during Viking raids, but the truth about what the women experienced is much more complicated and devastating than most people realize. By the end of this video, you'll understand why these raids represented something far worse than simple theft or conquest. You'll discover how an entire system was designed to exploit the most defenseless members of medieval society. The evidence I'm about to share comes from archaeological discoveries, surviving historical documents, and forensic analysis that has only recently come to light. Some of these findings have never been discussed outside of academic circles. This isn't just another history lesson about Viking warfare. This is about understanding a pattern of systematic exploitation that shaped medieval Europe for centuries. Let me paint a picture for you of what a typical raid looked like from the perspective of a woman living in 9th century England. Your village sits peacefully beside a river, just inland from the coast. Most of the men are working in fields far away or have traveled to nearby markets. The morning starts like any other, with women taking care of children, preparing food, and doing household chores. Then, the war horns echo across the water. The first sign of danger isn't the sight of ships. It's the smoke rising from neighboring settlements. By the time you see the distinctive dragon-headed fronts of Viking longships, it's already too late to run. These raids were planned with military precision. The Vikings had studied coastal settlements for months, figuring out the best landing spots, escape routes, and, most importantly, when the settlements would be most vulnerable. What happened next depended entirely on things that were beyond any woman's control. Age, appearance, social status, and pure luck determined whether someone would live or die in the coming hours. But surviving the initial attack was only the first challenge. The real ordeal began when the Vikings started deciding who would be valuable enough to keep alive. You see, Viking raids weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully planned economic enterprises. Every person captured represented potential profit, but women held a particularly complex value in Viking society. Some would be sold right away at slave markets. Others would be kept for entirely different reasons. The Vikings had developed a system for classifying their captives. Understanding this system reveals the calculated brutality behind these raids. Archaeological evidence from mass graves across Britain and Ireland tells a terrifying story. Researchers have found burial sites containing dozens of women and children, many showing signs of violent death. But even more disturbing are the sites where certain age groups are completely missing. Young women between the ages of 15 and 30 are rarely found in these mass graves. This absence tells us something crucial about what the Vikings prioritized during raids. The Vikings weren't just taking prisoners randomly. They were selecting specific individuals based on predetermined criteria. Women of childbearing age were considered the most valuable captives, but not for the reasons you might think. While some would indeed be sold as slaves, others served a different purpose entirely in Viking expansion strategy. Medieval chronicles describe how Viking raids followed seasonal patterns. Spring and summer raids targeted coastal monasteries and wealthy settlements for immediate looting. But autumn raids had a different purpose entirely. These later expeditions focused on capturing people who could survive the harsh journey back to Scandinavia. The logistics of keeping captives alive during long sea voyages meant that only the strongest and most valuable prisoners would make this journey. For women who found themselves aboard Viking longships, the voyage itself presented deadly challenges. These ships were designed for warfare and speed, not comfort. Captives were chained in the hull with minimal food and water. Many died during the crossing, but those who survived faced an uncertain future in lands far from everything they had ever known. The scale of these operations was staggering. Recent studies suggest that over 2 centuries of raiding, tens of thousands of women were taken from British and Irish settlements alone. Each raid typically captured between 20 and 50 prisoners, but larger expeditions could take hundreds. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a systematic pattern that reshaped the demographics of entire regions. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. The Viking raids created a demand that extended far beyond what their own expeditions could supply. Local warlords and corrupt officials began selling their own people to meet Viking demands. What started as foreign raids evolved into a domestic trade network that operated for generations. The evidence suggests this wasn't just about immediate profit. The Vikings were implementing a long-term strategy that would fundamentally change medieval European society. The women they captured weren't just slaves or captives. They were essential components in a larger plan that most historians have completely overlooked. The fate that awaited these women in Scandinavian settlements reveals the true horror of Viking expansion. Upon arrival, captives were divided into categories that determined their entire future. The process was methodical, almost clinical in its efficiency. Women were evaluated like livestock, their worth calculated based on factors that reduced human beings to mere commodities. Those deemed suitable for household work were distributed among Viking families as domestic slaves. But this wasn't just simple servitude. These women became integral to maintaining Viking society. While their captors raided other lands, they cooked, cleaned, tended animals, and managed entire households during the long months when Viking men were away on expeditions. The irony was cruel. The very people whose lives had been destroyed by raids now enabled future raids to happen. But domestic slavery was only one path. Many women faced something far worse. The Vikings had developed sophisticated breeding programs designed to increase their population for future conquests. Women of childbearing age were systematically paired with Viking men, not as wives, but as breeding stock. Their children would be raised as Vikings, completely disconnected from their mother's origins. Archaeological DNA analysis from Viking Age burial sites has revealed startling evidence of this practice. Researchers have found that many Viking settlements contained women whose genetic markers trace back to Britain, Ireland, and other raided territories, but their children's remains show mixed ancestry, confirming that these women were being used to produce the next generation of Viking warriors and settlers. The psychological warfare aspect of this system was particularly insidious. By forcing captured women to raise Viking children, the raiders ensured that their expansion would continue even without constant military campaigns. These children grew up speaking Norse languages, worshipping Norse gods, and identifying completely with Viking culture. Their mother's heritage was deliberately erased. Some women were reserved for an even more specific purpose. The Vikings believed that certain captives possessed special knowledge or skills that could benefit their society. Women who had been healers, midwives, or skilled craftspeople in their original communities were kept alive specifically to transfer their expertise. This wasn't mercy, it was strategic resource acquisition. The trading networks that emerged from these practices stretched across medieval Europe. Viking merchants established permanent slave markets in major cities, creating a constant demand for fresh captives. Women who survived the initial raids and sea voyage often found themselves sold multiple times, moving from owner to owner across vast distances. Each transaction took them further from any hope of returning home. Written records from Arab traders describe encountering Viking merchants selling women from distant lands. These accounts provide disturbing details about how captives were displayed, evaluated, and purchased. The descriptions read like livestock sales, with buyers examining teeth, muscles, and overall health before making their selections. The economic impact of this human trafficking was enormous. Entire Viking expeditions were funded by the profits from selling captives. The wealth generated from this trade allowed Vikings to purchase better weapons, build larger ships, and expand their raiding operations. Success bred more success, creating a vicious cycle that devastated coastal communities for generations. The stories of these women have been silenced for over 1,000 years, buried beneath tales of Viking glory and conquest. But the archaeological evidence speaks louder than any chronicle. These weren't just raids. They were systematic campaigns that transformed entire societies through calculated brutality. The next time you hear romanticized stories about Viking exploration, remember the tens of thousands of women whose lives were destroyed to build that empire. Their voices deserve to be heard. Their suffering demands to be remembered.